Okay, we start a whole series on 10 Commandments, and as an introduction, I'm taking from David Paulson. He gave a very long message or introduction to 10 Commandments. I'll splice it up to 3 different portions. Okay, 7 reasons why people don't study the 10 Commandments. The second one, 7 reasons why people ought to study the 10 Commandments. And the third one, 7 features in the 10 Commandments. Okay, we'll do it as 3 different ones. Today we'll do the first section. Okay, you can just write down the 7 reasons and we'll talk and discuss about it. I think they are important.
Let's turn to the Word of God now. Book of Exodus, chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. We're going to begin tonight a series of studies in the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20. Second book in the Bible. Then God issued this edict: I am Jehovah your God, who liberated you from slavery in Egypt. You may worship no other God than me. You shall not make yourselves any idols, any images resembling animals, birds, or fish. You must never bow to an image or worship it in any way. For I, the Lord your God, am very possessive. I will not share your affection with any other God. And when I punish people for their sins, the punishment continues upon the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of those who hate me. But I lavish my love upon thousands of those who love me and obey my commandments. You shall not use the name of Jehovah your God irreverently, nor use it to swear to a falsehood. You will not escape punishment if you do. Remember to observe the Sabbath as a holy day. 6 days a week are for your daily duties and your regular work, but the 7th day is a day of Sabbath rest before the Lord your God. On that day you are to do no work of any kind, nor shall your son, daughter, or slaves, whether men or women, or your cattle, or your house guests. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, earth, and sea, and everything in them, and rested the 7th day. So he blessed the Sabbath day, and set it aside for rest. Honor your father and mother, that you may have a long, good life in the land the Lord your God will give you. You must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not lie. You must not be envious of your neighbor's house, or want to sleep with his wife, or want to own his slaves, oxen, donkeys, or anything else he has. All the people saw the lightning and the smoke billowing from the mountain, and heard the thunder and the long frightening trumpet blast, and they stood at a distance shaking with fear. They said to Moses, you tell us what God says, and we will obey, but don't let God speak directly to us, or it will kill us. Don't be afraid, Moses told them, for God has come in this way to show you his awesome power, so that from now on you will be afraid to sin against him. As the people stood in the distance, Moses entered into the deep darkness where God was. And the Lord told Moses to be his spokesman to the people of Israel. You are witnesses to the fact that I have made known my will to you from heaven. Very solemn experience, that very deep moment, and God gave them just 10 commandments to keep. Christ said, I came not to abolish but to fulfill. One of the widest misunderstandings there is that Christians have nothing to do with the 10 Commandments. This is an introduction tonight. I'm just going to talk about the 10 Commandments generally. I remember seeing a cartoon in Punch magazine. It showed a rather disconsolate vicar standing at the door of his church, against the notice board which announced a series of sermons on the Ten Commandments, and through the open door you could see empty pews behind the vicar, and he was looking very wistfully across to the cinema where there was a great hoarding, stupendous, sensational Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, and there was a queue of people from the cinema door right round the corner, and the vicar was looking rather wistfully over at the crowds. But the crowds who went to see that film were not seeking sanctification but sensation. They were seeking entertainment, not edification, and though the film was entitled The Ten Commandments, they played a very minor part in the film. For the rest, it was a typical Hollywood extravaganza. Though Cecil B. DeMille himself appeared at the beginning of the film and just said briefly that in his personal view, he believed that Western civilization had been built on the Ten Commandments. And there is an element of truth in this. Now, I have 21 points to my sermon this evening. I'm going to divide them up into 3 main points. I want to give you 7 reasons why people don't study the Ten Commandments and don't think I ought to take you through them. I want to give you 7 reasons why I'm going to take you through the Ten Commandments and why I believe you ought to. And then I'm going to give you 7 features of the Ten Commandments that will start you thinking before we get into the first next Sunday. So we're going to have to move. Put on your spiked shoes and off we go. To many people, it's a very strange thing to do in the second half of the 20th century to go way back to the Ten Commandments. And here are the 7 reasons that I've come across why people say you shouldn't bother with the Ten Commandments today. Number 1, they are rules and regulations. And man doesn't need rules now. He's grown up. He's come of age. In this sophisticated scientific era, we don't need to be told how to behave. Treat us as adults. We're not kids anymore. We don't need to be told how to behave. Treat people as mature adults. Assume that they have common sense and they will behave. Now, this is being said on many sides and in the name of freedom, that what people need is liberty, not to be told how to behave, but to be treated as mature, responsible people able to discipline themselves. And this cry is being heard in many areas. An example would be students who no longer want the kind of paternal control of university rules and regulations, but say we want to be treated as adults, we are educated, we've grown up, no more rules. Well, it would be very nice if that could be so. But it doesn't work out. When people say leave it to common sense, I'm afraid sense isn't all that common. And we have found that in practice, in almost every sphere of life, we've got to have rules or we just can't live together. If I get in my car after this service, I've got to recognize that if everybody did as they liked on the roads, it would be absolutely impossible to drive. If I go and play football next Saturday afternoon, I've got to recognize that if there are going to be no rules, it will be impossible to play football. That's what's wrong with the game of rounders, as far as I understand. Every time I play it, there's a new set of rules. Every sphere of life has shown that people cannot behave together in society without rules. There have got to be some limits to our liberty if we're to enjoy that liberty. And the Ten Commandments tell us that also. But someone says, who has a right to tell me what to do? No man has the right to go to another and tell him how to behave. No, I agree, no man has. But God has. God has. He's the only person in the universe who has the authority to tell me how to behave, because he made me. And he can delegate that authority to others. He has delegated some of it to the police. But nevertheless, God has the right to make rules for my life. The second objection I come across is that the Ten Commandments are too negative, full of thou shalt nots. Of course, they're not all thou shalt nots. Some of them are quite positive. 6 days shalt thou labor. That's positive. Wouldn't think it's any more popular for being positive. But they are on the whole negative, not. And people say this is bad psychology. If you really want to get a good response from people, don't go with a list of nots, that will have just the opposite effect of the one you desire. It'll set up repression. It'll make them want what is forgiven. Put an X certificate on a film, everybody wants to go. It's the wrong psychology. I'm going to say I prefer God to psychology, if this is what psychology says. I think God knows better. And I believe that God knows that if you're going to have any morality at all, you have not only got to define what is right, you've got to define what is wrong. Otherwise people will not understand the limits of morality. You've got to say this is right and this is wrong, and then people know where they are. It is not enough just to say what is right. There has to be a closer definition than that. We need negatives. Indeed, even man before he fell, Adam in the Garden of Eden, needed a negative to make voluntary choice possible. If God had not put a tree in the Garden of Eden and told Adam that he couldn't eat of that tree, Adam would not have had a voluntary choice of choosing God's way. And even before man had fallen into sin, it was necessary to have a thou shalt not, so that man freely and voluntarily chose the will of God. It was treating man as a free being to say thou shalt not. But furthermore, since man has fallen, it is necessary for God to add to the list of thou shalt nots. Because having made his free choice and chosen the wrong one, then there are many other things that he goes on to do, and which God must fence and must clearly say are wrong. Thirdly, there are those who object to absolute morality and want it all to be relative. I mean by that, they want a morality that can be changed and adapted to circumstances. The objection is that these 10 commandments lay down absolutes which are always right or always wrong in every situation. And there are many voices today being heard to say that is not true morality. Morals will change in different situations. Morals are relative. They are not absolute. They can't always be this way. You've got to adapt. Now, I honestly believe, and this may be a little deeper point for you, but I believe that once you lose absolutes in morals, you lose morals. Sooner or later, if a thing is sometimes right or sometimes wrong, you get to the point where you do not know the difference between right and wrong. There have got to be some absolutes. Agreed, there are some relative questions, some questions that do change with circumstances. We are discussing these in the Tuesday fellowships just now. But there must be some absolutes. Otherwise, there is no absolute distinction between right and wrong, and things are a mixture. They're gray, they're not black and white. And sooner or later, that destroys morality. A fourth objection is that the 10 Commandments are old-fashioned. They're out of date. After all, they were produced 3,500 years ago or thereabouts. How can rules produced in a society and in a nation so far removed from ours and in circumstances so different, how can they possibly be relevant to me today? They're simply obsolete, old-fashioned, out of date. I've told you again and again about my dear friend, is dead now, Dr. Vine, away up in Yorkshire, who spoke to a youth club when he was in his 90s as a doctor, a medical doctor. And a girl at the end said, Dr. Vine, you're old-fashioned in your views. And he replied, my dear young lady, you came into the world in an old-fashioned way, and you'll go out of it an old-fashioned way, which was a very good answer to that modern miss. The simple truth is that though our circumstances have changed, though our clothes and fashions have changed, though our technology has changed, human nature has not changed. Neither has divine nature. God and men are still the same. And the astonishing thing to me is this: you read the 10 Commandments and then go out and read the news of the world and tell me these are old-fashioned and that they no longer fit our society. They're about the very things that human beings struggle with today. The very things. The newspaper headlines say nothing new at all. It's all there. Human nature has not changed. God has not changed. Our problems of relationships, either with each other or with Him, have not changed. So it's not old-fashioned. Fifthly, it's Jewish. The 10 Commandments belong to the Jews, and we are Christians. We have enough teaching in the New Testament from Christ without the 10 Commandments. That's Jewish. That's going back to the Old Testament. And we live in the New Testament. Now, this is a rather more subtle point. Let me just remind you that Jesus was a Jew, that he was born under the law, under the 10 Commandments. Let me remind you that 9 out of the 10 Commandments, the exception is significant, and we'll discuss that in 4 weeks' time, but 9 out of the 10 Commandments are repeated in the New Testament verbatim. They're applied to Christians as well. Let me remind you that Jesus said, not one jot or tittle of the law will pass away, that he came to fulfill it, to fill it full, to get it translated from legislation into action, to get it done. That's what he came to do. He didn't come to abolish or destroy the law. He came to get it done. Then there are those, in a more subtle way, who say that the 10 Commandments should not be studied by Christians because we are under grace and not under law. And that is a very compelling argument. I agree that we are not under law. The New Testament says we're not. But what does that phrase mean? That we don't need to bother about the will of God now? That we don't need to study his commands? Far from it. It is concerned primarily, that phrase, with the basis of our relationship to God. And if you read the context, it is saying utterly clearly that you cannot establish your relationship with God by keeping the 10 Commandments. To do that would put you under the law. It would put you under the curse of it because you can't keep them. And to live under the law, to have the 10 Commandments hanging as a threat over your head, is something the Christian has left far behind. We're not under law in the sense of having to keep the commandments to be right with God. The grace of God has produced a completely new basis for our relationship with him. We're not under law, we're under grace. But I shall show you later in this talk this evening that in another sense we are committed to the law of God. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But the motive for keeping the law has changed totally. The motive under the old law was to get right with God and to earn the right, the righteousness to enter heaven. And it failed miserably because no one could do it. The new motive for keeping God's law is gratitude. Gratitude. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And since he repeated the 10 Commandments, it follows that he includes them as an expression of our love. In other words, I no longer keep the 10 Commandments in order to get to heaven, but because I'm going there. And that makes the law my servant and not my master. I'm no longer under it. Now, the last argument against studying the 10 Commandments is this, and I'm going to deal with this thoroughly in subsequent sermons and in the fellowship, and that is that love is all that's needed. I'm going to call it loveism, as I did week past Tuesday, loveism. And there are many professing Christians as well as others saying this, that the only commandment we need is love. That if we love our neighbor and love God, then we can forget the 10 Commandments. And it sounds at first sight like a thoroughly biblical position. For the New Testament says, love is the fulfilling of the law. For what does thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery mean, but love your neighbor? And yet there's a dreadful flaw in this. If that's all I need to be told to love, then I don't need any of the other teaching of the New Testament. But in the name of love, people have begun to advocate breaking the commandments. And people who say that only love is needed are beginning to say that murder can be justified if you do it out of love. Adultery can be justified if you do it out of love. Stealing can be justified if you do it out of love. Lying can be justified if you do it out of love. As long as you love, and maybe you're saying at the moment, how could you love someone and do these? Well, let me tell you. Here is a loved one dying in dreadful pain and just can't cope with it, and the loved one is pleading with you to give them some pills. The new morality says, as long as you love them, give them the pills and kill them. There are those who are arguing that it is far better today for a husband and wife who cannot get on with each other, who make their lives and their children's lives a misery, and know someone else with whom they could make a happy marriage, that because there is love, they should go and commit adultery. Or what about a mother who steals a loaf of bread for a starving child because she loves that child? See what I'm saying? That if you say that love is the only rule, you are liable to start breaking the other laws. Does that matter? Yes, it does. God's definition of love is a love that keeps the commandments, not that breaks them. And because our understanding and our wisdom are limited and finite, I need to be told how to love. I need to be told what love will do. I dare not trust my own feelings in this. Let me give you a simple illustration. Two young people fall in love. They want to be married. They come to ask me when they can fix the date. They get a surprise. I talk to them about marriage, recommend books to them, tell them how to prepare for the relationship. And they might well say, you don't understand, Pastor, we're in love. We don't need to be told how to be married. We're in love, everything's going to be fine. We love each other, that's all that's needed as long as we love each other. If that's all that's needed, why do so many marriages break down? Because it's not all that's needed. Love can sometimes be confused about how it should be expressed, not understand it. So there is need for help and guidance, as every marriage guidance bureau would tell you. So God says, yes, you love me, yes, you love each other, but that's not enough. I want to guide that love. I want to tell you what love would do. With my wisdom and my infinite knowledge of the situation, I know how best love can express itself. And so I've given you commandments to show you how that love can reach out. I think the real reason why people don't like studying the Ten Commandments is very simple. J.B. Phillips translates one word of Paul's in the letter to the Romans like this: it is the straight edge of God's law that shows us how crooked we are. And if you forget everything else I say tonight, remember that sentence. It is the straight edge of God's law that shows us how crooked we are.